So here we are at the beginning of the journey. And at this point, creation has not yet begun. There are 7 days of creation, of course, not 8. But today we are setting aside this time to honor the place where we begin, the stage at which creation unfolds. If you've ever been to a play, you know that when a play is beginning, it is usually preceded by a blank curtain that is pulled away as the story begins. If the play were to begin in the midst of another performance, props and actors from another story still strewn about the set, it would be chaos. It would make no sense to the audience. And creation also unfolds with this blank slate. This blank slate is needed. And so we devote our time this morning to this void. Over the next 7-8 weeks, we will be exploring the days of creation as the divine template for our spiritual regeneration. And as many of you know, we'll be drawing on and lifting up much of the content of this book, of E. Kent Rogers' book, 7 Days of Spiritual Evolution, the Genesis of Personal Transformation. And I hope many of you will be reading along with me. Kent's book is really one of the best texts of the Swedenborgian tradition that I've read in a long time. He really brings about Swedenborgian principles not just in an intellectual way, but brings them to life with real-world examples. And also practices to help you get a sense of not just understanding these spiritual principles, but living them and acting them out in the world with real people, so that they become not just intellectual exercises, but exercises of life, and hopefully of the heart. I've shared with many of you that the Reverend Dr. George Dole, who is getting along in years, he spent his whole life devoted to Swedenborgian theology, and has recently made the declaration that what is primarily necessary to understand this theology is not a great mind, but a great heart. And I believe that Kent Rogers has one such great heart. And his work is also helping us to not just expand our intelligence, but to expand our hearts. So that's the work of creation, expanding our hearts. And we're diving into the Bible, into the story of creation, because we see this story as being the ultimate story of that process, a holy story, our story. The Bible unfolds from the very first page to the last as this process of spiritual evolution, as Kent likes to refer to it. That evolutionary process that we each go through as individuals and as a world. And in a way, the entire Bible contains that story, and you could say that the creation story is almost the thesis statement for everything that is to come, containing within it a template for that whole story that will be laid out in so much more exquisite detail. So as we dig into the creation story, we are digging into this process of spiritual growth, what Kent describes as the itinerary for our spiritual life. So let's start here with the void. I don't know if you can see it past my lectern, I apologize. Maybe you want to close your eyes even as we begin in this place of contemplating what that state of being, of nothingness, is like. It's like a seed germinating under the dark earth, an embryo growing in the blackness of its mother's womb. The mind of an infant before language has given any form to what they see and feel. Darkness, formlessness is an integral state in the processes of physical life on earth. And this is, of course, no less so in regards to the spiritual life. While our physical bodies are on a physical journey of growth and death, from infancy to old age, our spiritual bodies are on that same kind of journey. But this journey is not measured by shoe sizes or wrinkles. This journey is measured by wisdom. This journey is about acquiring spiritual wisdom, learning to love outside of ourselves, overcoming our inborn selfishness, and awakening to the deep truth that all we have and all we are is a gift from our Creator. Kent puts it like this on page 23. Quote, "All good is only ever of God, and where there is an absence of goodwill and kindness, there is a distortion and a partial absence of God. What we think of as self is the product of the boundaries limiting God's expression within us. Just as an absence of light creates a shadow, but that shadow is not an actual thing. The absence of God is what creates our sense of individuality or self, which also is not an actual thing." End quote. The void from which our spiritual evolution begins is actually the state of being where we live, in a sense, as a shadow. It is that state of being where we believe we are entirely alone on the journey, that we have created our own reality and that our purpose for being is to make that reality as pleasant as possible for ourselves. This is a state of being where we are unable to see outside of ourselves, unable to consider the needs of others, the greater good, and most certainly the reality of God, of any force of life greater than our 2 hands and 2 feet. Again, from Kent, he says, Selfhood is darkness, and in of itself void of spiritual goodness. Just like a capillary, in and of itself is an empty vessel. We can be rescued from that darkness only through God's selfless love, which is effectively more real than ourselves, and not something we produce ourselves. End quote. Our spiritual evolution begins when we recognize that we are living as a shadow. When we start to see and feel that we are only like this capillary and nothing unless we are filled with flowing blood, with life from God. And this is why the void is not an actual day in the process of creation. Because the minute that we recognize that we are in this state, this recognition is the first emergence of light, which we will get into next week. We can only, but this state of recognition, this moment, comes because we are willing to say that we are in the dark. Kent also has the great quote in his introduction that we can only be found by God when we are awake to the fact that we are lost. So while this void, this emptiness, this experience of being lost, of needing to be filled, while it is not fun to acknowledge, recognize that anytime you are able to acknowledge that for yourselves in any aspect of your life, that is the moment when you are moving out. Because the parts of us that are caught entirely in this selfish, isolated state, walking around and living as shadows, have no idea that they are doing so. This is what Jesus is talking about when he says, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin." When we are in this shadow state, in this entirely self-seeking state, this isolated state, we are slaves. Slaves to our own desires and compulsions. We are not free. And this is just how it is. It is the human condition. It is the journey. And the darkness, this shadow state, will not be overcome in an instant. The light will dawn in some areas of our lives, and in other areas we will remain ignorant. We will see as the story unfolds that the darkness will in fact continually return each day, the evening and the morning coming every one of the 7 days. Again, Kent speaks to this. Quote, "The persistence of darkness is a blessing in disguise. We never want to forget that a part of us is perpetually prone to selfishness and to succumbing to the delusions that support selfishness. Part of the thick darkness in which we begin is a kind of self-reliant arrogance. Understanding our inherent and perpetual darkness allows us to remain humble and thus in the light. Such humility leads us to daily seek God's help, knowing that on our own we would sink back into darkness. Awareness of the darkness also imbues us with empathy. We know that it's like to be enslaved with the delusions of self, so we are empowered to forgive and love others despite their shortcomings. End quote. Life is a journey through these stages. And we're on this journey together over these next 8 weeks, not so we can get to the end of them and declare ourselves evolved, but so we can engage the process. And perhaps, as I suggested when we began, in one small corner of our experience, where we perhaps begin to identify a void, an emptiness, a longing, a confusion, an experience of being lost, perhaps in that small corner we can engage this process and come more fully into the light. And maybe over these 8 weeks, one other thing we will gain is just a knowledge of these stages, so that we might honor each one. In my work with people, it's a pretty common experience for us to feel like we're okay and we're good and we're loved and things are going well when things are going well, and when the light is dawning, and when the flowers are blooming and where the sun is shining. And then sometimes when we're feeling lost and confused, when we're feeling that formlessness to believe somehow we're not being faithful, or somehow we've fallen off the spiritual path. The power of this journey is that each stage is totally necessary, and God is with us on each part of the journey. The new life of freedom that God is inviting us into requires all of these stages. If we are to no longer be slaves to our lower selves, and if we are to engage this process, if we are going to really and truly and fully in every aspect of our being invite in the Lord's life, invite it in so that it will course through our veins, then we must accept wherever we are along the way and continue to look to the good. As Kent describes, if the Bible is the itinerary of our spiritual life, if these days of creation are the itinerary of that walk, then in identifying where we are, then we can know, we can look to what's next. Because it is that next thing that is the purpose of the whole process. And that next thing, ultimately, is heaven. That life of freedom, of joy, of courageous and bold living, where we are fully receiving the Lord's blessings and sharing them with